A drone struck a nuclear power plant yesterday. Not in a simulation, not in a war game. Not in a classified scenario that defense planners run to test their assumptions. A real drone, launched from real airspace, penetrated real air defenses, crossed the perimeter of a real nuclear installation, and set fire to an electrical generator at the Barakah Nuclear Power Plant in Abu Dhabi. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations body responsible for monitoring nuclear safety worldwide, issued an immediate statement expressing, and I am using their exact words, grave concern and calling for maximum military restraint near any nuclear power plant to avoid the danger of a nuclear accident. Read that phrase one more time. Nuclear accident. The IAEA used that phrase in a live statement yesterday. The same language used when Russian forces occupied Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine. The same threshold of alarm. One reactor at Barakah, Unit 3, had to be switched to emergency diesel generators to maintain power. And while the smoke was still rising over Abu Dhabi, President Donald Trump went on Truth Social and wrote, again, exact words, "For Iran, time is running out and they had better hurry up or there won't be much left of them." And today, May 18th, 2026, we have just learned that Trump is convening his senior national security advisors in the White House Situation Room on Tuesday to formally discuss resuming military combat operations against Iran. My name is Michael Harrington. And what I want to do in the next 30 minutes is give you the complete picture that the headlines are not giving you. Not just what happened, not just who said what, but why this moment, right now, today, Tuesday, is the most dangerous decision point since this war began on February 28th. And why the decision made in that room will reach into your energy bill, your grocery prices, and the stability of an economy that none of us control, but all of us live inside. Subscribe now if you have not already. Because what we are covering today is being tracked by defense analysts, energy economists, and foreign policy advisors across 3 continents simultaneously. And the window for understanding it clearly is very short. Let's start with what actually happened on Sunday, May 17th, because the details matter and the mainstream coverage has already moved on to the political theater without explaining the technical reality. 3 drones were launched toward the United Arab Emirates. UAE air defenses intercepted 2. The third got through. That third drone struck an electrical generator located just outside the inner perimeter of the Barakah Nuclear Power Plant in the Al Dhafra region of Abu Dhabi. The Abu Dhabi media office confirmed the fire, confirmed there was no radiological release, confirmed there were no casualties. Those 3 confirmations are important, and I want to be precise about what they mean. No radiological release means the reactors themselves were not breached. The fire was contained to external electrical infrastructure. From a pure nuclear safety standpoint, the immediate danger was managed. But here is what the Abu Dhabi media office also confirmed, and this is the part that the IAEA reacted to with the language of maximum alarm. One of Barakah's 4 reactors, Unit 3, had to be switched to emergency diesel backup generators to maintain electrical power. In nuclear plant operations, losing grid power is a managed scenario that all plants train for. Emergency generators exist precisely for this contingency. The system worked as designed. But the system working as designed is not the same as the situation being contained. Because what Sunday demonstrated is not that the attack succeeded in causing a nuclear incident. What it demonstrated is that a single drone, 1 out of 3, a 33% penetration rate against UAE air defenses, can reach the electrical infrastructure of a functioning nuclear plant. And the question that the IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi is asking, that every nuclear safety authority in the world is now asking, is this: what happens when the next wave is not 3 drones but 30? That is the question that produced the phrase maximum military restraint near any nuclear power plant. That is the level of alarm behind what sounds, in translation, like a calm diplomatic statement. It is not calm. It is the global nuclear watchdog telling every military actor in this conflict that they are one successful strike away from territory that has no controlled outcome. Now let's talk about who did this, because the official position and the operational reality are already diverging. The UAE government stated it was investigating the origin of the attack. No official accusation has been made. That is the diplomatic language. The operational signal is less ambiguous. Anwar Gargash, diplomatic advisor to the UAE president, wrote publicly that the attack, carried out by what he called the primary actor or one of its proxies, represents, in his exact words, a dangerous escalation and a dark scene that violates all international laws and norms. The UAE Foreign Ministry called it a flagrant violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the principles of humanitarian law. On the same day, Saudi Arabia reported intercepting 3 additional drones launched from Iraqi airspace. Iraq hosts multiple armed groups aligned with Iran. The pattern is not ambiguous to anyone in the region who has been following the operational signature of these attacks over the past several months. And then there is the signal that Iranian state television sent, which CNN, ABC, and PBS all confirmed, and which almost nobody in Western coverage put in the proper context. On May 15th, 2 days before the drone strike, Iranian state television broadcast live footage of a news presenter receiving basic weapons handling training from a masked member of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That presenter then performed a mock shooting gesture directed at the UAE flag on live state television. This is not a clip from a radical fringe channel. This is Iranian state media, which speaks as an instrument of government, broadcasting a targeting gesture at a neighboring country whose nuclear plant was struck 2 days later. The message from Tehran could not have been more deliberately constructed. This is not over. This was never over. And the next time the message says, we will not miss. Let me now explain what is happening inside the White House, because this is where the next 48 hours get decided, and the details of how this decision is being made tell you something important about why it is being made. According to Axios, confirmed by Reuters and reported by Fox News, multiple U.S. officials have confirmed that Trump is expected to hold a high-level meeting in the Situation Room on Tuesday, May 19th, to discuss options for resuming military action against Iran. According to the New York Times, the United States and Israel are engaged in what the Times described directly as their most intensive preparations since the ceasefire took effect on April 8th for a possible resumption of attacks against Iran as early as next week. The most intensive preparations since the ceasefire. Two of the most capable military forces on Earth quietly, methodically preparing to return to war. But here is what makes this moment different from the start of the conflict in February, and what the framing of Trump considering military options completely misses. Before Saturday's Situation Room meeting was even announced, Trump had already convened a senior-level gathering at his golf club in Virginia. Vice President J.D. Vance was there. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there. CIA Director John Ratcliffe was there. Special Envoy for the Middle East Steve Witkoff was there. They met on a Saturday at a golf club to discuss the possibility of restarting a war. And Sunday evening, Trump personally called Netanyahu. According to the Times of Israel, the two leaders discussed the possibility of relaunching the war with Iran. After that call, Netanyahu convened his own emergency security cabinet in Jerusalem. He told that cabinet, and these are his exact words, "Our eyes are equally open when it comes to Iran, and we are ready for all scenarios." All scenarios. From a military commander to his cabinet, those words mean exactly what they sound like. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you need to understand how the ceasefire collapsed, because the media has given you fragments and called it coverage. The ceasefire was concluded on April 8th under Pakistani mediation, after more than 5 weeks of active bombing that the International Energy Agency described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. It was supposed to create space for a negotiated peace. What the United States wanted, Iran to accept zero uranium enrichment, surrender its highly enriched uranium stockpile, close its underground nuclear facilities, and submit to surprise inspections by UN inspectors. What Iran wanted, the lifting of the American naval blockade, war reparations, a complete halt to fighting in Lebanon, and international guarantees against future aggression. Neither side got what it wanted. The talks in Islamabad failed. A one-page memorandum of understanding, a 14-point framework that Axios described as the moment the parties had been closest to an agreement, was never signed. Trump rejected Iran's counterposition. He declared the ceasefire was on life support. And then on Sunday, a drone struck a nuclear plant. And Tuesday's Situation Room meeting was scheduled. There is a logic to this sequence that is not being reported clearly. The ceasefire did not collapse because one side was acting in bad faith, while the other was acting in good faith. It collapsed because the gap between what each side needed to survive politically and what each side could actually offer was simply too large to bridge in the time available. And now, both sides are back at the edge of the cliff, with the added complication that Iran has just demonstrated it can reach a nuclear installation, and the added political pressure that Trump cannot afford to look like he is backing down after Truth Social declared the enemy had better hurry up. There is a dimension to this crisis that almost no mainstream coverage is connecting clearly. And it is the dimension that explains something that otherwise makes no strategic sense. Why is Trump pushing toward military resumption when Iran's own president has shown signs of seeking a way out? On the same weekend that drones were striking UAE infrastructure, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared at a televised government meeting and publicly acknowledged that Iran had suffered real damage from American strikes. He urged his fellow officials, in his own words, to face reality. Read that carefully. The leader of a country that has publicly maintained for months that it will never surrender, that it cannot be broken, that American power has reached its limits in the Persian Gulf, that leader told his own cabinet to face reality. This is either a genuine signal that Tehran is looking for an exit, or evidence that the internal pressure is so intense that even the president can no longer maintain the public posture of strength. In either case, it tells you that Iran is not operating from a position of confidence. It is operating from a position of pressure. So the question that nobody in the major media is asking is this. If Iran is visibly under enough pressure that its own president is telling his cabinet to face reality, why is Trump convening a Situation Room meeting to resume bombing rather than to close a deal? And the answer, I believe, requires you to look at something that is hiding in plain sight in the economic data. According to Bloomberg, American crude oil exports surged to a record of over 6 million barrels per day as the Iran war pushed foreign buyers to seek alternatives to Middle Eastern supply. 6 million barrels per day, a record, achieved during a war that disrupted the supply of a competitor and created urgent demand for American energy. The Strait of Hormuz, which carries approximately 20% of all seaborne oil globally, has been operating well below normal capacity under a dual blockade. Every day that the strait remains constrained, American energy companies sell at premium prices into a market that is desperate for reliable supply. Every day this conflict continues at a controlled burn, the United States is extracting economic rents from a global energy market in crisis. And a peace agreement that reopens Hormuz ends that overnight. Iranian oil returns to the market. Chinese buyers stop paying premiums for American crude. Energy prices normalize. The extraordinary profitability that American energy companies have enjoyed since February disappears. I am not saying this is the only reason the Situation Room meeting is happening on Tuesday. I am saying it is a reason. And it is a reason that the people sitting in that room on Tuesday understand with mathematical precision, even if none of them will say it out loud. This is the real reason the pressure is not only on Iran, the pressure is also on Trump. The Beijing photo opportunity produced no Chinese commitment to pressure Tehran, no Chinese engagement to help reopen the strait, no Chinese leverage applied to the one actor that could change the calculation fastest. China gets approximately one-third of its oil through Hormuz. China has every economic reason to want the strait reopened. But China also has every strategic reason to watch America exhaust itself in a prolonged, expensive, and politically toxic conflict in the Middle East. Trump went to Beijing hoping to return with leverage. He returned with ceremony. And now he is sitting in Washington with a dying ceasefire, a drone-struck nuclear plant, a Situation Room meeting on Tuesday, and no major power ready to help him close the deal. Let me now be precise about what happens if the decision made in that room on Tuesday is to resume military strikes. The first consequence is the Strait of Hormuz. Already operating well below normal transit capacity under the current blockade, a resumption of active military operations creates the conditions for a complete closure. The Brent crude price, which had been declining toward the ceasefire period's relative stability, moved immediately upward after Sunday's drone strike. A full closure of the strait sends it back above the highs of the active war period, and the IEA has already described the first phase of this conflict as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. A second phase would be worse. American gasoline prices, which according to IAEA had approached $4.52 per gallon during the ceasefire period, would rise again. For an administration already facing inflation pressures, an approval rating at 36%, and midterm elections approaching in November, that is a political cost that compounds with every passing week of resumed conflict. The second consequence is Iranian military response. The Iranian Defense Ministry stated publicly on Sunday that their forces are, in their exact words, fully prepared to confront any new aggression. That is not diplomatic language. That is operational language from a military establishment that has spent the ceasefire period resupplying, repositioning, and assessing damage from the first phase of strikes. The third consequence is the activation of every regional front simultaneously. More than 450 people have been killed in Lebanon since the ceasefire was signed on April 8th, because the fighting there never actually stopped. It simply reduced in intensity. A resumption of the main conflict activates Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, and armed groups in Iraq all at the same moment. The military planners in that Situation Room on Tuesday are not planning for a contained bilateral strike operation. They are planning for a regional war that opens on multiple fronts the moment the first bomb falls. And there is one more factor that everyone in that room will be thinking about, but that none of them will put on the official agenda. The drone that struck Barakah was not a sophisticated system. It was not a hypersonic glide vehicle or a ballistic missile with terminal maneuvering capability. It was a drone that got through UAE air defenses at a 33% penetration rate. If the next wave of drones is larger, more coordinated and better targeted, and if it is directed not at the electrical infrastructure on the perimeter of a nuclear plant, but at the cooling systems of an operating reactor, the category of risk changes entirely. This is what the IAEA Director General's statement about maximum military restraint was communicating. Not a polite request for diplomatic de-escalation. A warning about a threshold that, once crossed, has no controlled outcome. So where does this leave us? Three paths. And I want to be precise about the probabilities because vague forecasting serves no one. Path 1 is a negotiated framework before Tuesday's meeting produces an escalation decision. This requires back-channel communication between Washington and Tehran to produce enough movement on the core issues, enrichment, inspections, the blockade, to give Trump a political rationale for choosing diplomacy over resumption. Iran's president telling his cabinet to face reality is a signal that could, if received correctly by Washington and transmitted through the right intermediary, produce exactly this kind of movement. The probability of this path over the next 72 hours, approximately 20%. It is possible. It requires actors on both sides to prioritize strategic rationality over domestic political positioning. That is a high bar in the current environment on both sides. Path 2 is a limited resumption of strikes, enough to demonstrate American seriousness, extract political capital domestically, and apply additional pressure on Tehran, without triggering the full-scale regional escalation that Path 3 represents. This is the option that military planners will present as the calibrated middle ground. Targeted strikes on specific Iranian military or nuclear infrastructure designed to be painful but not existential, with the expectation that Iran absorbs the pressure and eventually returns to negotiations from a weaker position. The probability of this path, approximately 50%. It is the option that looks controllable from inside the Situation Room. It is also the option that has produced escalation rather than de-escalation at every previous stage of this conflict. Path 3 is full-scale resumption that triggers the regional cascade, all fronts activated simultaneously. Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, oil markets in shock, Iranian military response targeting critical infrastructure across the Gulf region, and a conflict whose endpoint nobody in that room can define with any confidence. The probability of this path, approximately 30%, higher than it was before Sunday, because a drone striking a nuclear plant changes the political calculus for everyone simultaneously. It gives Iran a demonstration of capability that emboldens a faction of its leadership. It gives Trump a provocation that makes restraint politically costly. And it gives Netanyahu the rationale he has needed to bring his cabinet to all scenarios. Here is what I want you to take away from this analysis. The meeting in the White House Situation Room on Tuesday is not a foreign policy event happening to other people in a distant part of the world. It is a decision that will be felt within days in the price you pay at the pump, in the cost of goods transported by fuel-dependent logistics networks, in the stability of energy markets that underpin every sector of the global economy. If you live anywhere that uses oil, and every country on Earth uses oil, Tuesday's meeting is about your life, not just about geopolitics. The questions I want you to sit with are these. If Iran's own president is telling his cabinet to face reality, if the internal pressure on Tehran is as intense as that statement implies, is a military resumption the rational response, or is it the response that serves interests other than ending the conflict? The drone that struck Barakah was stopped by emergency diesel generators and a perimeter that held. What is the plan if the next drone penetrates further? And the hardest question underneath all of this, when a ceasefire collapses, not because one side is winning, but because neither side can afford politically to make the concession that would end the war, what does that tell us about the nature of the conflict itself? And about who is actually controlling its duration? Tell me in the comments what you think happens on Tuesday. Tell me whether you think the Situation Room meeting produces restraint or resumption, and what you think the real objective is. We track every development in this conflict, in the air, at sea, in the financial markets, and in the political capitals where Tuesday's decision is being shaped right now. That is what Michael Harrington does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually at stake beyond the headlines. Turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next briefing.